Since I haven't been able to write in a long time, I think it would be useful for me to put down my thoughts on my new epistemological system so I don't forget if I ever get a chance to write. This might also be a good way to relay it to people that want to learn about it without me having to go into the same details over and over if I don't want to. So the basic idea of this is this. If we define knowledge in sort of the classic way that it's defined as justified true belief, which is really what people are asking for when they ask you how you know things. They want a justification, and they want that justification to be true, right? If you require a justification for anything that you claim to know, then the pieces that you use to form that justification also have to be knowledge, and those have to be justified. And so you'll end up in an infinite regress and because infinite regresses are impossible to resolve in finite space or finite time, at least in this type of regress, where there's no decrease in the size of the step, it's essentially impossible for the human mind to resolve such a system. In fact, it's impossible for any mind, even an infinite mind, because it would require infinite time to satisfy this infinite regress. So any mind is going to have to come to some basic axiomatic presuppositions. So the question becomes, how do we select good presuppositions? So, just because these presuppositions will have to be selected without justification, you cannot justify them because in the process of attempting to justify them, you will have to either appeal to those presuppositions or to further presuppositions. That, however, does not place all presuppositions on equal footing. Just as the fact that nothing can be absolutely proven does not place all statements on equal footing. That is essentially the black and white fallacy. So we must figure out how to select good presuppositions. And I propose that the best way to select good presuppositions is to select presuppositions that are in principle unjustifiable. Not simply unjustifiable because we don't, in this reality, in this world, to use possible world semantics, we need to select presuppositions that are not justifiable in any possible world, not just presuppositions that are unjustifiable in this possible world. The reason I have this criteria is because presuppositions that are logically possible to justify, but simply unjustifiable in this world, are presuppositions that are essentially counter to or extraneous to our existence in this world, and so would only act as negative, it would only contribute negatively to our attempts to epistemologically understand this world. But there's another further and even more important criterion, and that would be that the presuppositions that we select must be performatively basic. That means that they cannot be denied without engaging in a performative contradiction, a contradiction between the maxim that your actions seem to be confirming, or the belief that your actions seem to be confirming, and the belief that you say you have. And performatively basic presuppositions or propositions have an interesting property where any attempt to justify them necessarily appeals to them. So other presuppositions would have to either appeal to themselves or appeal to other presuppositions, whereas performatively basic presuppositions would have to be appealed to themselves in any justification whatsoever. So they are essentially inescapable, as well as at least not contributing negatively. Furthermore, we would want to limit the number of presuppositions that we make in order to avoid the chance of being wrong. Because with every presupposition we add, we of course add new assumptions that may not actually be borne out. And we also run the risk of misunderstanding whether the presupposition that we are adding to our list is actually, in principle, unjustifiable and performatively basic. Since reasoning out whether something satisfies those two criteria can actually become a little bit of a nuanced and difficult task. So, with these criteria in mind, both for the list and for the contents of the list, I propose a simple list of presuppositions. To begin with, I exist. This is obviously performatively undeniable, for in the act of thinking to deny it, I am obviously confirming it, because what else is doing the thinking? But a ontological object that I experience as myself and has an access to itself, an identity with itself. So that's the first one. The second one is the laws of logic. This is because any coherent thought must necessarily assume at least the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction in order to mean anything. In order for me to have any thoughts whatsoever, I must, performatively at least, use these laws even as I deny them, in order for my thoughts to have meaning even to myself. Third, I must trust my own memory. As soon as a thought sort of passes the process of generation in my mind, the instant, in fact, almost in the very moment that it's generated, it becomes part of memory. If I am to do anything, experience anything, think anything, I must assume that at least prima facie, meaning at least until some reason is given to believe otherwise, my memory is reliable. Let's examine some other possible presuppositions. To begin with, there are the religious presuppositions. For instance, the presupposition that not only that there is a God, but that one has a special revelation from this God that gives one direct insight into the nature of reality, or at least the reality of reality, right? This is a presupposition that would seem to solve a lot of problems. It's basically a way to cut through any problems with epistemology or hard solipsism, or solipsism at all, by defining into existence an entity which could solve these problems, and then defining into existence a connection between myself and that entity. The problem is that just because something can explain or solve a problem doesn't mean that it is the actual solution or explanation. Just as saying that Superman drilled all sorts of canyons is all the canyons that we see in the United States, the Grand Canyon, whatever, is a very easy and far-reaching explanation, but that doesn't mean it's the correct one. Or just like saying, well, if I had rocket thrusters on my car, that would be a great solution to, getting over and through traffic quicker. That doesn't mean that's a viable solution or a solution in the real world. Even more problematic, this presupposition is not justifiable, even though it is in principle justifiable, because there are many people who claim to have special revelation from other gods that tell them different things. You could very easily be as mistaken about your feeling of certainty and your feeling of having special revelation as any other feeling or experience you have. You could be mistaken in your interpretation of what that is, and it's certainly not performatively basic. It is an assumption that could be made, that might be considered to be helpful, but is certainly not an assumption that needs to be made. And there are, I think that's the most enlightening example of an alternate presupposition that could be made. Now, you notice that the presuppositions I listed have nothing to do with the senses or a connection to the outside world. And this is because I actually believe that the problem of solipsism can, at least in part, be solved. Let me explain. I understand from the experience of my own consciousness, which falls under the basis of this axiomatic presupposition of I exist, I think, tells me that to be conscious is to experience an object. To be a subject is to perceive some object. Without an object to perceive, there is no subject. Now, the subject can perceive itself as its own object, as introspection. However, in order for that to be possible, the subject needs to exist in the first place. And that means that the subject needed to come into existence. And since an object is required for a subject to come into existence, there must be some external object, an object external to myself, that I have some perceptual connection to. This is what I might call the world, or the envelope, right? Now, I don't really know much about that. But the fact that I have an ontological connection to that thing means that there is some necessary connection between my perceptions and my consciousness as a subject and the object which it is perceiving. Which means that, again, prima facie, unless provided a reason otherwise, I should trust my perception of that object, since it is actually connected to something that exists. And because of that, I perceive the envelope as something that is around me, that is not dependent on, not globally dependent on my will, and that is material, whatever that means. And unless presented with any reasons why I shouldn't trust those understandings, they're as good as any others, and bear the most evidence with them. So now, why do I care about evidence and the senses and stuff? Well, we cannot escape this, whatever it is, this envelope that we are in. It might be a simulation or a trick by an evil demon, but we cannot escape it. We cannot escape its effects on us. We cannot escape the rules that it presents to us, or the nature that it presents to us. And so until we are presented with some reason to doubt it completely, or some way to escape it, we must wrestle with it on its own terms. We must accept the envelope. to use the Matrix as an example, until you are given the red pill and can escape from the Matrix, you still can't step out into traffic because you'll still die. You still have to work within the rules of the system. And the reason you care about evidence is because evidence is essentially the evidence is, the conglomerate collection of understandings that you have from your contact with whatever this is that's external to you. And if you care about living in that world, then you want to understand it. And your only contact with it is your senses. So you had better start collecting the data of your senses and trying to understand as best you can with as few assumptions as possible what it means. Now this brings up the problem of induction. How does your past sense experiences, the past evidence, indicate what something in the future should be like? And then we know that things can change. And we don't know the extent to which things can change. Maybe laws of reality can change. Maybe they did. We don't really know. But until a thing, in order to exist, must be something, which means that it must adhere to the law of identity, which means that it has certain properties. And that means that we should not, and so the laws that we see are part of those properties. And now things, unless we should not believe some proposition unless we're given evidence for it. That's important, because if you believe without evidence, then you must believe the infinite number of contradictory propositions that are possible to construct that have no evidence. And so one of the propositions is that some law will change. And so you should not believe that induction will fail unless you have some reason to believe that it will fail. Just the absence of a good reason to believe that it won't fail, just the absence of proof that it won't fail, should not mean that you assume that it fails. So you should move forward in life based on the idea that things will remain what they are until it can be demonstrated that they change. And once it's demonstrated that they change, then, presumably they've already changed, and you have to deal with the change anyway as it comes. In fact, one could consider the principle of induction another performatively basic presupposition, although you don't necessarily need to, in the sense that it actually is a prerequisite for any action, any interaction with the envelope. Because when you act, you are expecting your will to produce some result in your body, which then produces some change in the state of the world which you desired. Which means that you require the ability to predict what causes will produce what effects. And so, in order for action to be possible at all, you must first assume that induction works. Now, the fact that induction is, to a degree, justifiable is part of the reason why I didn't include it in the original list of basic presuppositions. But I do think that it is somewhat valid to include it as a semi-subsidiary presupposition, along with the semi-subsidiary presupposition of the prima facie reliability of the senses and the existence of the external world. So to bring this section to the close, essentially we have a list of presuppositions. First, that I exist. Second, that my memory is prima facie reliable. Third, that the laws of logic, at least the first two, hold. Fourth, that the external world exists. Fifth, the prima facie reliability of the senses. And then 6, the prima facie validity of induction. Now again, I must stress, none of these are absolute proofs in the way that we are used to meaning them. Absolute proofs are things that can only be produced in the context of defined a priori analytic concepts which we have set up so that the proofs can basically demonstrate a tautological truth. Proofs can have nothing to do with reality, whatever reality is, unless they begin with premises that we draw from reality. But the problem is that although we cannot be wrong that we have a certain experience, we can be wrong about the interpretation of the experience. And unless we're doing phenomenology, when we're deducing things about reality using premises from our experiences, we're using our interpretations of those experiences as the premises, not the fact that we had those experiences themselves. This means that any deduction that we do is only as valid as how correct our interpretations of sense experiences are. And again, I need to stress, the fact that we cannot have absolute certainty in the way that Descartes may have wanted, or a mathematician may want, or a presuppositional apologist may want, does not mean that we cannot act. We act on things that we are not certain about all the time. In fact, we must. We just need to apportion our level of certainty to the amount of reasonable evidence from our senses that we have. And the reason we must do that is because we have no escape from our senses. We must wrestle with our senses. We must deal with the world as it is presented to us, and we must act within it. And if we care about the world, if we care about living, then we must begin with an attempt to understand the world, which means using our senses. This means that any good, rational basis for an epistemology, any basis that would allow us to live, must, at its core, begin with, well, at least once the basic presuppositions that can allow for justification at all, have been laid out. It must begin with senses. It must be about the world. This is another reason why the special pleading of special revelation is invalid. It begins with something that is totally disconnected from any possible reality, that is totally within our own heads and the definitions that we come up with, and then tries to get to reality. And the problem is, how this sense is usually used means that, or usually understood, means that it comes with baggage are separate from and therefore can conflict with our attempts to understand reality, can drive a wedge between us and reality. And someone who is not willing to begin with what is real, or deal with what is real, someone who's willing to stray from it, is by necessity insane. So I think that's a good end to section 1.